Lorine had imagined her arrival differently. She had pictured someone, anyone, waiting at the gate. A nod, a hand offered to help her down from the wagon. Perhaps even a child's hesitant smile. But when the wagon rolled to a halt outside the weather-beaten house, no one came forward. The driver gave her a brief glance, muttered something about the end of the line, and drove off, leaving a trail of dust and silence in his wake. She gripped the side rail with one hand and her cane with the other. The wood was damp with the recent rain, and the earth below had turned to thick, clinging mud. Her foot slipped once, her bad leg twisting slightly. Pain shot up her side, but she swallowed it down. She had learned, over the years, not to let pain show. From the porches of the nearby houses, faces stared. No one offered to help. She could hear them whispering, voices low but clear enough to sting. That's the new wife? She can't even stand straight. God help those boys if she's supposed to raise them. She heard them, and she knew they wanted her to. The cruelty wasn't hidden, it was a performance meant for her to absorb. She kept her eyes low, trying not to trip on her skirt as she dragged her suitcase behind her. Her dress, once a soft blue, was worn thin and now clung too tightly around her hips, the fabric straining against the swelling in her joints. Her left shoe was scuffed near to tearing, the sole nearly worn through. She'd dragged her weaker leg across 2 states, from Missouri to this corner of the Wild West, chasing a hope she wasn't even sure was real. He had written just one letter, simple, brief, and without romance. My sons need a mother more than I need a wife. It had said, if you've got kindness in you, that'll be enough. She hadn't expected love, she hadn't dared to, but she had hoped, quietly, in the far corners of her heart, for respect, for a place, for something more than pity. She reached the wooden gate, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed it open. The hinge creaked. Still, no one came. No man, no boys, no voice calling out in greeting. Her heart sank. The front door opened at last, not to her husband, but to a thin boy, barely 10. His eyes were tired, his jaw tight, a child who had already known too much disappointment. He looked at her the way someone might look at an abandoned thing on the side of the road. Not cruel, exactly, just cold. Without a word, he turned and walked back inside. Lorine stood for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She limped after him, the suitcase thumping rhythmically against each step of the porch. Inside, the house was dark. Dust hovered in the slanting light that cut through the window. There was no fire in the hearth, no scent of dinner, no warmth of any kind. She could see another small figure peeking from behind a chair, perhaps 5, 6 years old. The moment their eyes met, the child disappeared from view like a startled rabbit. She cleared her throat, unsure if her voice would hold. Where's your father? The older boy shrugged. Gone out. Then he added, like a dagger in the ribs, he don't like cripples. Lorine didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, but it hurt more now because she had wanted this to work, for them. Not just for herself. She wanted these boys to have something more than a roof and leftovers. She wanted them to know steadiness. She set down her bag beside the cold fireplace, lowered herself carefully into a crooked chair, and stared at the ash like it might speak. This wasn't a home, not yet. But it could be. She had traveled too far and lost too much to turn away now. She reached into her coat and pulled out the letter again, the one that brought her here. The one that had made her believe there was a place for someone like her. If you've got kindness in you, that'll be enough. It didn't promise she'd be wanted, only that she might be needed. Her hands ached as she stood again. Her cane wobbled against the uneven floorboards, but she spotted a broom leaning against the wall and reached for it. She didn't ask for directions. She didn't wait for gratitude. She just began to sweep. The dust rose around her like old ghosts. But she kept moving. She swept every inch of that hollow space until her arms shook. Later, she found the kitchen, cold and empty, but a cellar door behind it revealed a sack of flour. Half forgotten and covered in cobwebs. She would wake before the sun the next morning. Knees swollen, fingers curled from arthritis. But she would need bread with every ounce of strength she had left. She would feed them before they had time to question it. She didn't have the right name or the right body. She didn't have their blood or their affection. But she had shown up. And she would stay. They didn't call her Mama that first night. Or the next. But she set the table anyway. And swept the floor again. And left a sliver of light in the hallway for the youngest. In case he was afraid of the dark. Outside, the stars blinked cold and distant. But inside, Lorine held on to something warmer. The belief that love doesn't always come fast. Or with fanfare, but it can grow quietly in the corners where no one else is looking. And in the silence of that empty home, with no one to thank her and nothing to lean on but her own will, Lorine chose to stay. Because sometimes, staying is the bravest thing a person can do. Lorine didn't come to the ranch expecting affection. She hadn't dared to hope for warmth. Not from the man who wrote her a marriage proposal without meeting her. And certainly not from the 2 boys left behind by a woman they still mourned. She knew enough of grief to recognize that her presence would be an intrusion. Not a comfort, at least at first. But that didn't matter. She hadn't come to be adored. She had come because there was work to do. And because even a stranger could show up and try to do it right. The house was hollow when she arrived. Hollow not just in structure, but in spirit. Dust covered everything. The kitchen was cold. The pantry nearly empty. It wasn't just that the man of the house had died weeks ago, it was that the boys had been living alone. Emotionally and practically, they were used to absence. So she filled the silence. Not with noise, not with speeches, but with motion, with purpose. On her second morning, she rose before the sun, joints stiff from sleeping on the lumpy cot, and began baking bread, not because anyone asked her to, not because she was trying to impress, but because 2 growing boys needed something in their stomachs besides burnt ends and cold biscuits. Her hands shook as she ground the last of the cellar's flour. Her fingers curled with pain as she kneaded the dough. She lit the stove with care. Her every movement a battle between intention and limitation. But when the smell began to drift through the walls, yeast and warmth and memory, the air in the house shifted. Micah, the youngest, peeked into the kitchen with bare feet and wary eyes. Lorine didn't speak at first. She just turned and smiled, not broadly. But enough. A smile that said, "It's safe to come in. I'm not going anywhere. There's honey on the shelf." She said gently, "Want to help me find it?" He stepped forward, tentative, almost afraid. "Mama used to put it in tea," he whispered, not meeting her gaze. Lorine felt the catch in her throat. But she didn't let it show. She just nodded. "Maybe we'll try that again." By the time Eli walked in, the table had been set. The older boy stomped across the floor, face pinched, shoulders tight with suspicion. "You don't belong here," he snapped. He only wrote that letter 'cause he was drunk. She didn't flinch, didn't fire back. She simply poured him a cup of warm milk and placed it beside a thick slice of bread. "You don't have to like me," she said calmly, her voice firm but kind. "But your brother needs breakfast. And so do you." He didn't sit, but he didn't leave either. He stared at the cup like it was something dangerous. Something that might burn if he got too close. Then slowly, cautiously, he tore off a piece of bread and ate it with his back turned. Lorine said nothing more, because words meant little in a place where promises had been broken and absences had spoken louder than love. So she didn't waste breath trying to explain herself. Instead, she showed them. When the floorboards creaked from the wind, she patched the gaps with scraps of fabric and stuffing from an old pillow. When Micah couldn't tie his boots, she knelt beside him and guided his fingers. When Eli scraped his elbow falling off the fence, she cleaned it with quiet hands, offering neither scolding nor sympathy, only presence. She swept, she sewed, she scrubbed, all without needing to be asked, all without expecting thanks. And bit by bit, the walls of the house began to breathe again. A fire stayed lit. The windows were opened. Fresh bread replaced dry crusts. Micah started calling her Miss Lorine at first, careful and formal. But one evening, as she tucked him in beneath a quilt she had mended, he mumbled through a yawn. "Good night, Mama." She didn't correct him, didn't draw attention to it. She just kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sleep well, baby." Later, alone on the porch, she let herself cry for the first time. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet realization that something real was growing here. Not because she forced it, but because she earned it, moment by moment. Act by act. Eli took longer. He always would. His eyes remained sharp. His voice guarded. But he started bringing in firewood without being asked. Started sitting at the table before being called. Once, he even leaned on the kitchen doorframe and said, "That stew didn't taste terrible." It was the closest thing to a compliment she would get for a while. She didn't need declarations. She didn't need grand gestures. What she needed, and what she gave, was consistency. Stability. A rhythm the boys could trust. A new kind of normal that didn't erase the past, but gave it room to heal. Lorine didn't rewrite the family. She didn't replace their mother. But she filled the silence with effort. With devotion. With the kind of love that never demands to be seen, but makes itself impossible to ignore. She didn't ask them to call her anything. But when they did, when the word mama slipped from their lips without hesitation, she carried it not with pride, but with deep, quiet gratitude, because she knew, love didn't have to be loud. It just had to last. And she would. Lorine had known peace only briefly. A few quiet weeks of cooking breakfast, folding shirts, tending to the garden, and tucking 2 boys into bed. The town still watched her with cautious eyes, but no longer with outright cruelty. The boys, Micah, especially, had begun to smile more. Eli no longer flinched when she offered help. There was a rhythm forming. Not perfection, but something like a family. And then the letter arrived. Folded crisp and handed to her by a boy from the post office. The words inside cut through her heart like ice. Petition to revoke guardianship of minors. Filed by Ruth Harland. Ruth, her late husband's cousin. A woman who had not once come to visit since the funeral. Who had left a pie on the porch and a note that said too much for one woman to handle. And now, she was back, not to help, but to take. Lorine read the document 3 times. Her hands trembling. No will had been found. No official papers named her guardian. There were only letters from the man who had brought her here, letters of hope. Not legality. She had no blood claim. No marriage certificate. No inheritance to lean on. Just crumbs of trust she'd earned with every meal. Every bandaged knee. Every bedtime story. And now it might not be enough. The hearing was set for the end of the week. To be held in the town's church hall. A judge would come from Dry Creek. People would attend, not just Ruth, but townsfolk who had once whispered about the crippled woman with no place here. Lorine didn't sleep the night before. She watched the boys from the doorway as they slept, Micah curled into a tight ball. Eli stretched out, one hand still clutching the drawing he'd made for her days ago. She didn't tell them she was afraid. But in the morning, her hands shook when she buttoned her dress. The church hall felt colder than it should have. The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a heavy book of statutes on the table before him, barely looked up when they walked in. Ruth was already seated, her expression tight and sure. She wore black, as if mourning something stolen. Lorine held the boys' hands, one on each side. Micah squeezed first. Eli didn't, but he didn't pull away either. The judge opened with dry protocol. Names. And dates. Then Ruth stood. "She's not blood," she said sharply. "She has no legal right to them. My brother-in-law's will was never found. And this woman," she gestured at Lorine with the contempt of someone shooing away a stray, "was never his wife in the eyes of the law." Lorine felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she said nothing. She had promised herself she would not argue, not until it mattered. "They need real family," Ruth continued. "My sister's farm has room. They'll have cousins, real school, a proper home." The judge nodded, took notes. Finally, they asked Lorine to speak. She stepped forward slowly, her cane echoing against the wooden floor. "I don't have land," she began, her voice dry with fear, "or money or any papers worth showing. But I've had Eli's fevered head in my lap at 2 in the morning when he was too scared to call for help. I've taught Micah to spell his brother's name. I've packed their lunches, sewn their clothes, and locked the doors at night so they can sleep safe." She looked around the room. Everyone was watching. If that's not being a mother, I don't know what is. There was silence, heavy, uncomfortable. The judge cleared his throat. "It isn't a matter of love," he said flatly. "It's a matter of law." Lorine's heart dropped. She felt the words like a verdict already passed. But then, a voice rang out, small but steady. "Sir, may I say something?" It was Eli. He stepped forward, thin arms stiff at his sides. Jaw clenched. "She's our mama," he said, loud enough to echo. "She's the only one that stayed. She limps because of what happened to her, not what she is. If you send her away, you're sending us away too." The silence that followed was electric. Even Ruth couldn't speak. Then Micah stepped forward beside his brother, holding up the spelling book she'd made from torn papers and string. "She taught me every letter," he said softly, "and she never forgot which of us was older." The room shifted. Mrs. Hemsworth, from the bakery, spoke up. "I've seen that woman walk those boys to school every day, rain or shine." Old Bert from the general store chimed in. "Watched her patch that roof herself when the storm hit last month." "Ruth, you didn't even bring a bucket." One by one, the voices rose. People who had once whispered now spoke truth. Not out of pity, but out of recognition. The judge leaned back, looked at Ruth, then at Lorine. "No formal will," he said at last, "but I see no harm being done here." Petition denied. Lorine didn't cry, not then. But when Micah turned to her and whispered, "Does this mean you're really ours?" she felt her knees begin to buckle. And the boys caught her. They didn't have her blood. She didn't carry their name. But in that moment, she carried something heavier, their trust. And it was enough to stand on. The first time someone tipped their hat to Lorine in town, she almost didn't notice. She had just come out of the feed store with a sack of flour in her arms, her cane tucked under one elbow and her hip aching from the long walk. It wasn't until she paused at the edge of the boardwalk to catch her breath that she realized Mr. Pritchard, the man who ran the blacksmith shop, had nodded to her in passing. It was subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. A nod of acknowledgement, not pity. A gesture that said you exist, a sharp contrast from the whispers and turned backs that had greeted her when she first arrived. For weeks, months even, Lorine had been invisible to this town. Or worse, an object of ridicule. The crippled bride, they called her. The stranger with the limp who took in someone else's children. She had heard it all. From the porch murmurs to the muttered insults in the general store line. But she had stayed anyway. She'd endured the cold shoulders and the second glances, all while sweeping floors, baking bread, stitching shirts, and whispering lullabies to boys who hadn't yet believed in lullabies again. She hadn't asked for acceptance, she had simply kept showing up. And now, slowly, the town was beginning to see her. It wasn't grand gestures, it was little things. The banker's wife offering her a basket of overripe peaches. The storekeeper slipping an extra bar of soap into her bag without charging. A woman from church stopping her on the street to ask about Mika's cough. And back at the homestead, something even more precious was taking shape. Lorine noticed it one afternoon as she returned from hanging laundry. The boys had been oddly secretive all morning, whispering in the shed, gathering bits of wood and leftover paint. She hadn't pressed. She had learned that with boys, sometimes the best way to earn trust was to give them space. When she rounded the corner of the house, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, nailed above the front door in all its crooked glory, a handmade sign carved from scrap timber. The letters uneven but bold. "Our mama lives here." Micah stood proudly beside it, face smudged with red paint, eyes beaming. Eli leaned against the railing, trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. But his ears were flushed, and he kept glancing at her like he needed to be sure. Lorine stepped forward slowly, tears springing to her eyes before she could stop them. She reached up to run her fingers across the rough wood. The grooves of each letter were deep and deliberate, proof that this wasn't something thrown together in passing. This had meaning. This was their declaration. "You sure about this?" she asked, voice breaking slightly. Eli straightened. "You came. You stayed. That's all it took." Micah nodded with the kind of simple certainty only children possess. "Now everybody'll know." Lorine tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. So she did what she always did, she pulled them both close, pressing her face into their hair, breathing in the scent of dirt and sun and belonging. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the porch filled with golden light, a neighbor rode by on horseback. He slowed, then reined in completely, squinting at the house. "Nice sign," he called out with a grin. "Looks official." Eli raised a hand in a mock salute. "Sure is." The man chuckled and tipped his hat before continuing on. the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Inside the cabin, the oil lamp flickered as Lorine ladled stew into mismatched bowls. The boys set the table, forks backwards. Napkins wrinkled, but proudly done. Micah had drawn another picture. This one of all three of them beneath a big sun with family scrawled in bold letters across the top. The sign above the door had done something words never could. It had announced to the world, and to themselves, that they were no longer fragments trying to fit. They were a whole. That night, Lorine sat on the porch after the boys had gone to bed. The cool breeze brushed her cheeks. But she didn't shiver. Her body ached, as always, but her heart felt light. She looked up at the sign again. Our mama lives here. Not the woman who cooks here. Not the one who stayed out of pity. Mama. She thought of all the things she had never had. A wedding dress. A proper family name. A warm welcome. But now, she had something better. She had two boys who no longer flinched at love. A home where laughter came back slowly. Like spring after a long winter. A town that was beginning to forget its cruelty and remember its humanity. As the stars blinked overhead, Lorine let herself smile. She had not been chosen by law, by blood, or by ceremony. She had been chosen by need. By presence. By love in its truest, quietest form. And now the world knew it. Because sometimes, all it takes is a wooden sign and two boys brave enough to carve out the truth. She's ours. She always was. It was a quiet morning when Lorine found the letter. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just straightening shelves in the pantry. Trying to make sense of half-used jars and boxes of buttons and string. The cabin had slowly become hers in subtle ways. She didn't claim it, but her touch was everywhere now, in the patched curtains, the steady rhythm of meals, and the way the floor stayed swept, even after the boys tracked in mud from the creek. The letter was tucked behind a cracked lantern, inside an old wooden box worn soft at the edges. She hadn't opened the box before. It had belonged to him, their father. And though she'd spent months in this home, part of her still treated his belongings like sacred ground. But when she saw the envelope, marked only to the woman who will raise my sons if I can't, her breath caught. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the old floor creaking beneath her weight. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the page. The handwriting was rough, shaky in places, but it was his. There was no doubt. If you're reading this, I must be gone. I don't know who you are. I don't know what brought you here. But I pray you're someone good. Not perfect, just someone who stays. Someone who loves them enough to fight for them. Lorine pressed the letter to her chest. Her throat tightened, tears welling in her eyes. She'd never heard him say these words. He hadn't needed to. They were here, hidden in ink, carried by the faith that someone, some woman, might come and choose to love these boys as her own. He had written this not knowing her name, her face, or her limp, and yet, somehow, he had spoken directly to her heart. That afternoon, she wrote her own letter. She sat with the same paper, the same pen, and began with shaking hands. To the boys, if you ever find this and I am no longer here, I want you to know something. You were the reason I stopped running. You were the reason I stayed. You called me, Mama, before I ever believed I deserved it. And that made all the difference. She folded the letter and tucked it beside his. Two pieces of a puzzle now complete, a father's hope and a mother's choice. Bound not by law or blood, but by love. Later that week, they packed the wagon for town. Spring had returned to the hills, and the boys were bouncing with energy. Micah begged for peppermint sticks, while Eli claimed he was too old to care but still eyed the candy through the store window. As they rode down the lane, dust rising behind the wheels, Lorine sat straighter. Her back still ached, her knee still throbbed, but her heart was light. At the general store, a woman she didn't know very well narrowed her eyes and asked, half sneering, "Are those really your boys?" Lorine didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, they are." The woman raised her eyebrows, as if expecting argument or shame. But then she looked closer, at the way Micah was holding Lorine's hand. At the way Eli stood just close enough to her to count as protection. Even if he wouldn't admit it. "Well," the woman said finally, a touch of softness in her voice. "They seem proud of it." Lorine's chest tightened. She nodded politely and turned back toward the wagon. Micah jumped onto the wheel to climb inside, then twisted around and called, loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear, "Come on, Mama." Lorine froze. She had heard him say it before. In whispers, in bedtime mumbles, in quiet morning greetings. But this was different. This was public. This was proud. This was a name given not in secrecy, but in defiance of all the people who had ever doubted she belonged. She climbed into the wagon slowly, her smile trembling. Eli passed her the reins without speaking, but his fingers brushed hers, deliberate and sure. They rode home in peace. The wind tousled their hair, and the fields bloomed with wildflowers along the edges of the road. The boys bickered and laughed. Micah told a terrible joke and laughed at himself. Eli rolled his eyes but smiled anyway. When they reached the cabin, the hand-painted sign above the door caught the golden light of the setting sun. "Our mama lives here." The letters were still uneven, the wood still crooked, but to Lorine, it might as well have been carved in marble. Inside, they ate stew together. Micah had drawn a new picture, 3 stick figures, arms linked, a sun overhead, and the words "Our Mama" scribbled in blocky letters. Lorine didn't need a certificate. She didn't need a surname match. She had something stronger. She had earned their trust. She had stayed. She had loved without condition. And now, when the world asked who she was, she could say with joy in her voice and truth in her heart, "I'm their mother, not by blood, but by everything that counts."